Well, I mentioned to Carolyn, and I don't know if you'd heard earlier, that the snow has started to fly today in Fairbanks. And it so happens that earlier this week I was driving from North Pole to Fairbanks as we finally had a good solid week of frosts at night. And there were quite a bit of wood trucks coming from Delta Junction and the Tok area. And coming, Salsha, North Pole, coming into Fairbanks. I think a lot of people are gearing up for the winter with wood. And it's not just individuals who have discovered in the interior that with the BTUs of about 8,000, rating of 8,000 BTUs roughly per pound, that they can make out even at $250 a cord, twice as much as far as a heat point of view. They can get twice as much heat as opposed to $4 a gallon fuel oil. But a lot of schools have noticed that too. And I think fuel oil right now is about $4 a gallon. But again, even at $250 a cord of good dried wood, and somebody can burn wood. And again, depending on the efficiency of their burner, just in looking at raw BTUs of the fuel stock can come out twice ahead. So a lot of schools have been starting to look at their bills and look at the fact that they have limited resource, especially the rural ones that don't have a significant tax base or have the ability to get taxes aside from what they receive out of the funding formulas from the state. They're trying to find out ways of basically saving their teaching staff or buying more materials. And so in an area that really, for the most part, traditionally by most superintendent of districts, hasn't been in their purview, and that is what energy sources are we going to use, it's kind of front and center now for many. And most, we'll go through a list as well as some different pictorials of different systems that are up. Most of those that are using wood instead of oil are falling in the interior area within a 300-mile range of Fairbanks or in southeast Alaska. Southeast Alaska, there are quite a few down in the Thorn Bay area and such like that. So in general, there are obviously different heating sources for different districts, and they're made by the districts at their level. So the Department of Ed, they basically have a formula for deferred and a list for deferred maintenance that would help a school maybe to, when their name comes up on deferred maintenance, to get a new burning system. It would also, a boiler system of some kind. It would also help with efficiency measures such as insulation, or if they wanted to do some type of alternatives, such as schools up in the northwest region of the state that are now using solar panels at 90 degrees as their siding on the south face. Usually that'll be covered when a school comes up on deferred maintenance, on the deferred maintenance list. But in general, the school districts will decide upon themselves, and to be quite honest, in talking with the Department of Ed in the state Alaska Department of Ed, they kind of anecdotally hear about maybe some schools that have converted over to a boiler system that'll burn wood instead of fuel, or that have maybe figured out some type of renewable that they're plugging in, maybe battery banks for wind and such, but they don't require that kind of information. In fact, at the end of every year, or school year rather, when there's large amounts of reporting back to the state, often utilities, that is the power or the electrical bills, and the expenditures on heat are all clumped up together. So a school might be pulling off of the grid and just having the accountants pay every month, just like clockwork, the utility, and they may be buying large amounts of fuel from the vendor. But to be honest, not only are those amounts clumped up, but when you call the individual schools, which I've done, as well as the fuel vendors, especially in rural areas, it so happens that it's not as easy for them just to look up and give you a total tally of we burned this much oil this year. I did what I could in a little bit of research that mostly, the piece I'm going to show today mostly focuses on the interior, a couple examples in the interior. And it takes a little bit of detective work to find out exactly how much was spent on what, as far as capital for maybe a windmill or solar panel, as far as energy efficiency methods such as lighting. Sometimes lighting is clumped together, so new bulbs if they go to LED bulbs. So what I'm going to go through today is just kind of a general synopsis of some general savings that we know about. And the only way to really get a comprehensive view of the whole state in your community is to actually call the district itself. So let me start out here. I'm going to go ahead and advance the slides. So obviously in Alaska, down in the Panhandle, down in Southeast, we have M for Maritime region. It obviously is rainforest at times, certainly, and different amounts of precipitation, different amounts of cloudiness, different types of wood, and different access points to schools. Is their challenges for getting energy and operating are going to be very different than up in the Arctic region, up towards the top where Barrow is. And their stock of energy is going to be very different too, even amongst that region. So for instance, in Barrow, the school, as I understand, runs off natural gas because Point Barrow in the 1920s, they had naval petroleum researchers up there, and they, had almost a century ago tapped gas fields. But you won't find that throughout that school district. In other areas in that school district, the schools are possibly still flying in diesel oil, and there's certainly above the Brooks Range is no wood. The interior area has an awful lot of wood, and a lot of this is spruce, very dense spruce, not really good timbering logs per se for lumber, but certainly good as a fuel source. And we'll see in a few moments that the type of wood and how it grows together in its size will kind of dictate also as to what kind of feeding system or preparation the wood needs. It's going to probably be different than down in Southeast with the type of woods that you have down there. So Alaska is very different in its size and climates and its local fuel stock. And as I mentioned, a lot of superintendents see their role as equipping the teachers with the right textbooks, materials, making sure that the bills are paid and making sure that there's enough teachers. They don't see themselves as a plant manager per se. I was talking one time with a district that had a university inside of it in the Midwest, in the Red River Valley. And we talked about the possibility of the university putting up a wind turbine in a very windy area, and asked the school superintendent to come to the table. And he did. He came to the meeting. And after it was all said and done, we showed some scenarios where they could actually save money. And they could be a partner in this wind turbine with the university and with the city. But his comment, not unlike most superintendents, was, that's not my job. I might be able to have cheaper prices and maybe more money for supplies or teachers, but I'm not a utility guy. And this would have been a situation where it was islanded or separated probably away from the utility in a sense, and so it needed some more expertise. But in Alaska, because of the fact that you can't just in a lot of our districts go and put up a levy or a referendum for more money as prices increase in providing education, some teachers are really starting, or some superintendents have really started to look at, in a holistic sense, how do I keep the doors open at a cheaper price? And I mentioned that there's a kind of rotating that schools go off of on the deferred maintenance list, and it's usually in the past it's been backlogged. There's been needs for revamping of schools or rebuilding entire schools, but they've often outlived their useful life. You'll have P-traps, just things I've seen in the villages. You'll go to use the sink in the shower room, and there's no P-trap and hasn't been for years. There's not running water in certain parts because of difficulties with piping. Also, lumber may be being degraded as you not use, or leaky roofs, maybe certain parts of the gym or an entire gym, these kinds of things. So when a school does come up on the top of the list for deferred maintenance and receives money for large capital improvements, that is usually when some of the other districts I've noticed, especially in Northwest Alaska and Southwest Alaska, have taken advantage and redone their energy systems. They just can't afford to do it any other time. And so anyway, a lot of rural districts also are somewhat subsistence economies. And so even if you could pass levies or tax bases or try to increase the tax base, collecting is a whole different issue. So here's the reason why a lot of schools have decided to go to biomass or wood. In 2000, you'll see that roughly for Alaska Gateway, which is the Tok region, just as you come into the state from Yukon, fuel oil was $1 a gallon, and then in 2011 you're $4. Okay, so you've gone up fourfold in a matter of basically a dozen years. Well, the problem with that obviously is that if you again have a limited budget, you've got unions with teachers that protect their pay and are asking for increases. You've got supply cost increases. So it's been large in part the entrepreneurial spirit that a lot of superintendents have taken on has been due to the pricing. Not entirely, but large in part that's the case with fuel oil. So Alaska districts. This is a map of Alaska school districts, and it's not the easiest to see, but you can see that some of these districts really span out for hundreds of miles. So I don't know if you're able to, can you see my mouse at all? Does it appear on the screen? I'm moving it around right now over the words Alaskan school districts. Are you able to see that? Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs up. Oh, thumbs. Okay, good. Well, so for instance, the Iditarod school district that covers this area, you're talking, I believe, less than a dozen sites. But that's a massive, massive amount of territory to cover, and there's a mountain range in between. And so you have a situation where the school districts obviously just can't tap into the same electrical grid and take advantage of that kind of condensing of power. And for heat, you really can't do anything but produce your heat per site. As where obviously when you're on the road system, it's a different story. You can go ahead and from one community to another take advantage of economies of scale per se. The other thing is that in the McGrath district, the Iditarod school district, you'll have some villages that are serviced by barge for their fuel oil, and some that are inland, are going to have fuel oil either flown in or drug across a muskeg, which you, in some cases in that district, you can do only because they're military roads for some military bases. But my point is that even for one district, to get a fuel source, you have to take a couple of different avenues. The boilers that I know about that are operating that have converted over from fuel oil fall basically in 9 districts. The first one is Southeast Island School District. They've converted over to garns, which burn large logs that are about 3 foot long, and any type of wood. But it takes about 2 feedings in a day. They stack them hot and heavy in the morning and cram as much wood and burn them fast. And they have a huge water jacket around the boiler that heats up, that distributes the heat in a real crude sense. So you're using cord wood, and they're using that over at the Kaufman Cove Elementary School. In Craig, my understanding is they've gone in with the city, and like a lot of small rural Alaska districts, there are sometimes shared facilities that the district pitches money in, and the city or the tribe pitch money in. So Craig, they've been using what they call a chip tech boiler, and that's mostly for heating water. So they've been using that for the pool, and then also distribution of heat in the elementary and the middle school. Now Delta Junction, they have been using the same system as Tok because they're about 150 miles down the road. And when they saw that things worked in Tok, they adopted it. And they're actually chipping up at $60 a ton, $60 a ton for spruce. They're getting chipwood, and they're throwing it into the boilers by huge hoppers that big loaders load up. Being available with a conveyor belt, it's just kind of a 24/7 type of relaying of the chips straight into a boiler, a very large boiler. So that's Delta Junction, and that's also Tok. Elam is kind of unique. Elam, they've taken one of these garn boilers and they've stuck it in a large shipping container. So that and at the factory, they've got a large konnex, and it's in the konnex, and they just wire everything there. So that some of the costs that some districts have had to absorb of having an electrician come in and figure out all the wiring, and a plumber come in, and they have to be certified and such, and they have to kind of make their own controller board, that's taken care of in Elam with just being in the konnex, because inside the konnex, they have their own controller panel as far as the electronics, and they have all the plumbing already done. So all you do is you scoot the konnex up next to the school, I'm told, and you just basically connect a hot, a cold, and just connect a regular electricity source from the school, and it feeds into a control box already on board inside the konnex. And the konnex also allows for a drying of the wood, which is very important. So the konnex has probably about 20 feet, I believe, where you can just stack wood. And there's obviously going to be inside that konnex heat given off from the boiler as just exhaust, or not exhaust, but just as bypass heat. And that helps to cook or act as a kiln, so to speak, on the wood and drive out the moisture. And the moisture is a huge issue, especially as you get into southeast with the wood. Even in the interior, we've had situations in a different way where we've had moisture be a problem. And that typically is they'll chip up entire trees. I'm talking bark, roots, whatever dirt is hanging on the roots, and they put it in a huge hopper. And then it's 60 below. And it's already what would be considered by Southeast standards as bone dry wood, maybe at 20-25% just right out of the earth and chipped up, and soon after, a week after, maybe 25% roughly humidity or moisture content. But there's enough moisture that they'll put a tarp over it, and then it'll be 60 below. And that cold will wick the moisture up to the top. And on top of that tarp, then you get a frozen layer of chips because the condensation or the moisture hits that tarp, and the tarp, of course, is cold on top. And so they've had some issues with the difficulty of the frozen chips then not being able to go into the feeder. and the feet are getting clogged and such as this. In Southeast, you probably would not experience, I imagine, that type of difficulty with the with the cold and the icing up of chips being fed. But what would happen, what they've dealt with in Southeast in trying to dry the wood, is recapping all the BTU value they can. So if you have a humid or marine type climate, and you've got wood that hasn't been seasoned or dried for a year and covered, you might have a fairly high moisture content, and a good amount of your BTUs that you could use for heat are now going to be used up to basically drive off the moisture as the wood is cooking inside the boiler. And so you lose a lot of BTUs. The other problem you have is your smoke ends up having a lot more particulate matter because of being cooler due to that moisture situation. I'm being very general, very, very general, but you end up with a more particulate matter in the air also. So at least a year in the interior, even as dry as we are, we say you need to dry your wood. Tanana has a very unique situation, and that what they've decided to do is take advantage of their location. They do have some pretty good spruce trees and birch trees up along the hill or the mountain that's right behind them. However, the cost of fuel to go out in snow machine or truck and to cut it and then haul it in, the cost is prohibitive when you look at the fact that they're right at the confluence of the Yukon and the Tanana River, which means this, that when breakup comes about and you have shifting ice, it often digs at the bank and you get hangers, they call them. Hangers or snaggers. You get 30-foot trees that were on the edge straight up, but then they get scoured where the ice has gone by on the coast, and then they kind of fall over like this. And as you drive down a boat down the Tanana or the Yukon River, in the summer you can even see trees that are just half their roots are hanging on and half their roots are exposed. And pretty soon they flop into the water. And when they do, along with being tossed and hurled downriver and even being scrubbed maybe during breakup with ice and such, they end up floating right by Tanana with basically no bark and no limbs. Just a scoured long log, maybe 30, possibly 40 foot long. They get some good sized spruce. So what they tend to do is they take a boat out with a lasso and they yank them up onto shore. Now they have very silty water because of being at the headwaters, and so that's caused some problems with some degradation of the bottom of their boilers. They're using garn boilers. So the water quality that's used in the water jacket can determine to some extent the life of these boilers, and that's something to look at. But in general, they end up with just more wood than they could ever use floating downriver. As long as they pull it up on shore and they let it dry. There had been a concern that there would be glass buildup because of a lot of the silty sand hanging onto the wood and being embedded in the wood, and clunkers, as they call them, kind of the leftover byproduct with the ash in the boilers. It really hasn't been too much of a problem, though, not as much as just, again, the metal starting to deteriorate. And so they heat their washateria, and what they're heating is they did a huge weatherization on their school of extending their walls with insulation, and it didn't really pencil out for them to go and necessarily change the fuel system that they're using at the school, but it's the teacher housing. In many of these tribal communities, a teacher can move in, but they don't necessarily have the ability to buy a lot of land, or there's high turnover and they know it, so they don't want to invest in building their own house. So they rent from the district housing. And that's how the district has made some money, is reduced their own bills of what they're having to pay to keep teachers alive and well in the not dorms necessarily, but in the individual apartments. Now, Tetlin, Alaska has gone with a different type. They've gone with a tarn boiler system. a Tarn boiler, and it's just another brand. It does not have a water jacket over the burn box, but it does heat up water. Thorn Bay has worked with Garn. Again, they've worked with some of these Garns in large connexes, and I believe that they maybe even on the island have, with one of the respective schools, a pellet boiler. But I'm not that's something I need to check on. Burning pellets. I know that there was some talk of going that way. Tok, Alaska has been kind of the brainchild of a lot of this. In fact, Tok has gone to the extent of not only getting all the heat they need off of a boiler, which pretty much the idea was birthed out of fire remediation, because there's such a tinderbox of having to move wood away from the school. They had to stack it. And well, what are we going to do with all this wood? Well, in thinking it through, they saw the logistics of being able to use it for heat. So they've made out really well. But in addition, they've decided to even produce their own electricity off of a steam turbine attached to the boiler, basically. So they're at the point where they can produce not only enough electricity for the whole school, but they also are, through changing from oil to firewood, they now are at a point where they can produce excess, and they don't get paid for that. I don't believe, because there's kind of a rationing quota system. Even though they dump their extra electrons or electricity that they produce onto the grid for local users, the local utility is not obliged to pay them for it, due to other users online putting, through solar panels and other technologies, electrons onto the grid. The last one that I'd like to mention that's kind of unique is Copper River. Copper River School District. I tried for years in the Kenny Lake area on the way down to Valdez to go ahead and get a boiler for heat, and they get 60 below in the winter. But they ended up, it didn't work out, various reasons, and so they ended up buying these large kind of step vans, more or less, and gutted them and put in growing lights, and now they have attached these what they call profab boilers. And the profab boilers are working off of cordwood, as I understand, and they're providing heat for 12-month gardening, more or less, of fresh produce. Tok, by the way, had decided, because of having extra heat, to put in greenhouses for fresh produce. So here's a couple of entrepreneurial examples where not only is the money savings just simply from not using oil going towards more teachers and supplies, but they're also they're reducing their food bill for their school lunch program by growing their own food from some of the heat that they could never afford to do off of oil. So one thing that you need if you're a school district, obviously, and you're looking at getting off fuel oil and going with biomass, and by the way, biomass doesn't just mean trees. Biomass in some places of the world means that they grow algae, not the conditions that we would do so here. Biomass might be large grass fields, hay fields. Biomass plants often burn in boilers down in ag or farm country, leftovers from the corn season, corn stover and such like that. But in Alaska, by and large, unless it's maybe alderbrush that you can almost bale up in a huge roll bale, it's going to probably be just plain old firewood, of course, or just wood, period. And hopefully it's going to be wood that obviously doesn't have a higher value use, such as lumber and such. So I mentioned that the Tanana and Yukon rivers send clean driftwood each spring down. There's also the case in Token or in Delta Junction. One of the reasons they're able to get their wood at $50 or $60 a ton delivered from a mill about 45 miles away is that there's a mill that already produces a lot of sawdust and chips. And it used to be a liability for them to get rid of it. But now they can sell it. And in some cases, such as up by Tanacross and Tok and Delta Junction, there have been weird windstorms, almost like having cyclonic effects or tornado effects of just wiping out huge swaths of the trees or bending them over from the winds being so strong and killing the roots so that they're standing, but their roots are jacked. All of that, there's a danger of being a good habitat for beetle kill. For beetles to come in and then start to get into the live trees. So some of these windstorms have, for instance, in the Delta Junction area, I think I've heard figures of they could operate just on the dead stuff standing right now, and some of the stuff that was laying down. School could heat itself for half a century just on wood that's available, just from that, not even cutting down live timber. And in the case of Delta Junction also, they do a lot of growing of barley to keep their ag culture alive, more or less. And there's no brewery around that it's cost effective to send the barley to. So barley is a good biomass material. Now, in general, barley is better than, at the cost of about $200 a ton, it's better than fuel oil you'll save on by burning barley, but still with wood at $50 a ton, it can't beat that. And so there are some small home burners that are burning in the Delta area, but not the schools. So I want to kind of focus for the most part on the interior schools that have gone to biomass. You'll see Fairbanks in the red just so you have a locational idea. And then you'll see Tanana to the left and to the right, Delta Junction and Tok. And I mentioned that a lot of the interior has dead standing wood or wood that's been down, that's fuel on the ground, that for fire remediation purposes, it's worthy just to get it out of there and have a controlled burn, i.e. in a boiler during the winter for the schools. In fact, over the past quarter of a century, over $100 million has been spent by state forestry, and probably that also includes federal forestry, just to get fuel off the ground, just to get rid of dead trees and make sure that there's not worse fire situations. Now, Delta Junction, just to give you an idea, this is their firehouse, or their I guess, not firehouse, but their boiler house in the upper left. And you'll notice that smokestack. That smokestack, I think, goes up 35 feet. Not necessary by, I think, EPA standards, but they put it up high just to make sure that any kind of particulates and such would have a much more elevated entry point into the atmosphere. Now, I want to mention that there's one school in Southeast that used to do biomass, but basically, last time I talked to them about a year and a half ago, shut down. And they said the shutdown was for this reason. There was a teacher who I don't believe was a local person living there, but a teacher who was concerned because when the boiler would start up, unlike when they had the oil boiler, the biomass boiler would put out large amounts of white smoke. And there was concern about the outdoor air quality, which up in Fairbanks is a huge and a real issue about particulate matter damaging people's respiratory health day in and day out. However, the fact of the matter is, from what I understand in Southeast, the smoke was from a very clean combustion process, and it pretty much was just at the startup phase. Whenever you're going to do ignition of fuel, of wood anyway, you're going to have kind of a lot of vapor coming off, white smoke, and you're going to also, because you're at cooler temperatures in the beginning, have more particulate matter. But once it started to get going, it was pretty clear. But because it was a school teacher who was concerned, at the time they were trying to figure out ways to alter that so that there wouldn't be any smoke or have a better burning process. And I don't know where they're at now. In Delta Junction, if you go on a clear day at 20, 30 below, there'll be white smoke coming out. But again, for the most part, it's going to be just vapor and heat coming into the atmosphere. So you'll notice, you'll notice in the right-hand picture, there's a Hearst boiler. And that boiler is technology, or I mean a Hearst box. And that is technology that have been gotten from Toke. You have a very large, you'll see on the left, a very large big blue bin that loaders just heap it into. Actually, I think the way that they have it here at Delta Junction actually is that there's a cement empty vault that the loaders come and dump all the chips into, and it has an auger. And the auger then feeds that blue hopper, so to speak. And then that goes to what's called a Messerschmitt's burn box. And so it just augers straight in. Now, what's nice about chips, if you can control the contamination of a lot of gravel and junk like that, though Toke has shown it's not necessary, you can have a real smooth auger operation, so you don't have to pay somebody to be a loader. You don't have to pay somebody to a salary to make sure, and it's pretty automated. You don't have to worry about someone not showing up for work and loading the boiler with a lot of fuel wood. So anyway, these systems work fairly efficiently. It does take time for a school to get the angles right, to work out the bugs, so that they can rely on that thing around the clock. Tanana, by the way, Delta Junction has about 1,000 people. Tanana downriver, and you'll see in the upper left-hand corner, just on the very bottom of the picture, the lobe of the Tanana River, and then the Yukon, or the Tanana, excuse me, up high, and then beforehand to your right would be the Yukon coming in. And that's a screen, or a helicopter view of the village of Tanana. And again, they have kind of a hill setting background. To the right is it's just a log tribal hall. And down in the center picture to the bottom string, you'll see cords and cords and cords of 4-foot sticks of wood piled up. Now, they had a surprise. They went ahead and became very entrepreneurial, in that they knew that at $250 a cord, they were still making out twice as good as fuel oil, and it cost them more than it does $4 a gallon because they were downriver and the barge had to bring it down. I think they were more towards $5 a gallon. So they ended up a whole industry. They told guys, okay, here's the deal. You bring in a cord of wood and the city will pay you $250. Well, they got out there with their boats and they started to lasso the wood in the springtime, bring it up on shore, bring it to the city. Some of them didn't have chainsaws, so the city would buy a chainsaw and say, okay, the chainsaw is, a couple $100. Every time you bring in a cord, we'll pay you the $250 minus $25. So they kind of strung them along to make sure that they would get in the hang and learn how to use the saws, and they would basically be setting up kind of a company shop. And then that's where the wood would come in. Well, one day apparently they ended up getting a barge made out of large logs, like a huge Tom Sawyer raft of over 80 cords of wood lashed together. It was several feet submerged in the water. And what happened was upriver, a tribe, Stevens had heard about the money that was being paid out, so they went and cut over 80 cords, put it in the river, had it stay still, lashed it together, and rode it down for about I think a good 4 or 5 days as a raft, and delivered it on the shore and said, okay, 80 cords, $250 a cord. Here it is. And the city paid them for it. So it started an industry even farther upriver. Now, the type of box, the burn box you'll see on the lower right hand is the garn. And the garns come in various sizes. But basically, where you see the wood stuffed in, that's going to be a system in which it's going to capture the gases. When you throw a wood on a fire, log fire, and it's just kind of open with a brick chimney and a damper, half of your BTUs go up in gases, and that's with dry wood. That's with dry wood. And so this system, being kind of like a round cylinder about this big around, and then having a burn box this big around, you stuff your logs in, and it heats that water in that donut ring on the outside, but it also catches all those gases because the water acts as an insulator and traps the heat in the burn box, which means that the burn box burns even more fast and furious at a higher temperature, which captures those gases before they can leave. And there's also some, not ducting, but fluing system that happens to make sure. So it's a very efficient burn. Now, Toke, as I mentioned, in the upper right-hand corner is their same color as Delta Junctions, is their boiler area. And they use, again, on the left, the same as the Messerschmitts and the Hearst. And then on the lower right is their chipping facility. It's a hockey rink. It's summertime, there's no ice. They go and they just pull up this big chipper there. And as you can see, with the spruce that are fed in, everything goes in all at once and makes those chips. Again, the main problem with the chipping here in those kind of temperatures is just keeping the chips really dry so that you don't have condensation that can clog things up at very cold temperatures. So I mentioned that in the past quarter of a decade, or past quarter of a century, that for the interior as a whole, over $100 million was spent in fire remediation. Just in the Tok area, and part of the reason why they were the first school in Alaska to go with biomass, and they were the second school in the nation to ever try the steam turbine to create electricity from biomass. There's one other in Montana, was because, again, they themselves spent 60 million years in a quarter of century just to suppress fires. And 6 times they had to evacuate the whole city, or at least portions. Toke's not a traditional city as far as having a main street with retail vendors and such like that. It's kind of strung out against the highway and the cutoff going down to Valdez. So they've had 6 evacuations. And so with the school building almost burned up, and the city buildings, they just started by creating a buffer and realizing they had all this excess wood. So I mentioned that they're looking at putting in greenhouses and then heating those, but not only greenhouses, they're going to also use, not only greenhouses for food, for the lunch program, they're going to also use some of that excess heat to basically make biology and horticulture laboratories so that the kids can learn about growing and have it as a part of their regular coursework. In addition, they're looking at having extra heat now, and they're looking even beyond the greenhouses at possibly getting a pool just to be a heat sink, just to drop the heat into warming up the pool. It'll be good for the community as far as physical activity and such, but it helps them figure out what to do actually off the steam turbine, what to do with a lot of that excess heat. And there's been talk also of maybe reversing the process of pouring heat in, or taking that extra heat and reversing the process, almost like refrigeration, and getting an indoor hockey rink powered by the steam turbine and the boiler that's creating the power and heat. So one of the things that each of these school districts has probably done at one point or another is gone to the Alaska Energy Authority. And Alaska Energy Authority has had, in the last 8 years, a renewable energy fund that schools and other entities, different entities, facility-type entities could apply for. And as long as it was a renewable energy, they could, have different reports and studies done. And a lot of schools were funded. Some of them were just for conservation measures to see if after putting in more insulation and trading out bulbs and reducing your demand of electricity and heat, there was even a need to convert a boiler over. And in some cases, they assisted, I believe, with even new facilities that were going to be built as a chip in to that capital. Now, it's one thing to look at Alaska that's fairly unique and say they have a lot of money for renewable energy. They must have a lot of programs going on to help them with this situation of $4 a gallon, and that's on the road system. Some villages, the schools will be paying $10 a gallon for heating fuel, over 10 actually. So it's pretty easy to just say, well, all they need is money. But that really isn't the case. There are different types of capitals that a community has to have in order to make a project like this pull off. So Neil Flora, who's a sociologist from Iowa, has the different type of capitals that she's lined out that are necessary. So yeah, you need to have money to pay for engineers, to pay for studies, in order to build capital, equipment, boilers, loaders, chippers, okay? And you need to have natural capital around you. You know, these projects don't work, up on the North Slope as biomass projects because there's no wood. So you have to have natural capital. You need to have some type of fuel stock close by. And cultural capital. You need to have a community that kind of knows who they are and isn't just merely a transient community where there's flip over every year of people who are there and aren't there, and there's no real history per se. And then you need to have human capital. You need to have the ability of people who are skilled. And in fact, in Tok, I talked at length for a couple hours once with the guy who runs things there as far as the boilers and such like that, and has to be sure to be on top of operations and maintenance. Hey, that took time. That took time to those specific boilers, to that system. And then when they went into the steam thing for electricity, it really took a huge learning curve. So you need to have somebody who's knowledgeable, obviously, to run things. And then you need to have good social capital. In other words, you need to have communities where there's good glue that kind of binds people together. And that might be seen in the forms of civic groups like a strong Rotary Club, maybe Toastmasters, maybe churches, maybe different auxiliaries, the Eagles, where people are used to coming together and putting on pancake breakfasts or things, and they know how to get behind a project. Now, I know of one community that never put their school on the boiler, but they had the first biomass boiler with state assistance basically back in the mid-90s. And I will tell you today that that community is now back on fuel oil, and it's largely because I think of that community and how it was made up. It was a fairly small community, and there were 2 big families or 3 big families, and the boiler got neglected, and basically the boiler station started on fire, and it was just easier to go back to oil. And for them, oil is probably better. But in some communities where you maybe have large groups that are in competition with each other possibly, or there's conflict, you can get all the money you want in the world and all the boilers you want, as far as you can have all the wood around you that you want, and you can know, when your town hall or tribal hall was established. But if you can't keep it together to make sure that when Joe from this family is going to be heading out for 2 weeks to Hawaii in the middle of winter, that Jim from this other family is willing and knows how and is talking to go ahead and do the boiler system, it just isn't going to probably pan out even once you get it in. And then the last part is political capital. Most of the communities that successfully pull these projects off are communities where even if everybody doesn't feel they get their way, they know that they can have a voice in the matter. They know that they can go to the local city hall meeting when this is being looked at, and they can offer their expertise from their walk of life. Even if their way isn't chosen as to what model will be chosen of a boiler or how it'll be used, they're usually behind the project if it makes sense, because they've had some buy-in. So in general, I just want to mention, and I have a whole different presentation on the other types of different renewable energies that schools in Alaska use. I've inventoried all that I know of, and there's some geothermal, exacting heat out of the ground with kind of a refrigeration type of system, or not system, but background. There are solar panels, there are wind turbines, such as that. Some schools have looked at using hydro, especially in Southeast. But in just looking at wood, Tok actually had a couple of huge advantages. They were able to financially tie together several sources. They had the Renewable Energy Fund from Alaska Energy Authority. When it wasn't enough, they went to the legislature and they were able to get an earmark or an appropriation. They have very technically minded people in Tok, kind of a lot of guys who, can take a arc welder and a paper clip and make it into an ashtray or a carburetor. You tell them. A lot of that type of mechanical know-how. And they have a large built-up system along the highway because it was an important junction during the war, and when the Alaska Alcan Highway came through. I mentioned they have a lot of wood. The superintendent of the school was very savvy, knew his community. He'd been in the bush or worked actually for bush schools anyway. And socially, a lot of people, they are in an unorganized area. In other words, there's no borough government out there and such. If it was going to happen, it had to happen through them. So I've mentioned a number of things, and in conclusion, biomass in some cases was already a part of the tribal or energy conservation. Like Tanana, they just expanded it. They started with the Washateria, then they went to the schools. In some cases, in all cases except for one, diesel was the main heat, and they keep those boilers in as backup in case the biomass boilers have a problem. And I mentioned the cost of fuel, and the buildings with capacity are not using their full capacity, and some are looking at district heating. Do I have any questions at this point? That's pretty much the summation of my presentation.